Before we get into this, I want to talk to you about something that happened recently that I think just transitions into what we're going to talk about in the next few Wednesday nights. Last January, the Rushings were moving into their new house. We were very excited for them, coming back to the good side of town in Springfield, right? Not from Eugene. And so, appreciate it. They got to open up a door for them. And so they were downsizing, and they had something that they wanted to grace me with. Brother Cody said, "Hey, I got this bike frame here. I'm never going to probably use this again. Would you like it?" I said, "Sure, why not? I have a bike. It's working fine, but sure, I'll take this bike frame. One of these days, maybe I'll do something with it." So I took this bike frame, no handlebars, no wheels, no back derailleur. It's just made of the frame and some basic components on it. I took that thing. It was a busy season, and we were starting out the new year as a church, and a lot of irons in the fire. So I just took that and put it in the basement. And the process of moving around, the kids kind of moving around, it kind of got scratched up. And I thought, well, one of these days. But I took a gander. I said, "Cody, you don't happen to have like a spare set of handlebars around the house, do you? I mean, that you're never going to use again?" He says, "Actually, I do. And I got a bracket as well, a stem for the handlebars." And so he brought that and gave it to me. I'm like, "Oh, cool. I'll just put that over on the side." And it just sat there and collected dust. Well, around springtime, I thought, I wonder what it'd be like if I took took my wheels and everything from this bike and bought a few components and put it on this new frame, new to me, and just put it on there. And I am not mechanically inclined at all, and so I leaned on my 15-year-old son, Elijah. He loves to tinker, and I said, "Elijah, would you be up to just running some of these cables for me?" He's like, "Sure, Dad, I'll take care of that." I'm like, "Man, that would be a blessing. Let's see if something like this would work." Well, we put all this thing together. I bought up the components that need a new derailleur, a new cassette in the back, and so we put all these different components together on this frame that Cody had given to me, and I thought, I'm going to take it for a spin. I'm going to hang on to my old bike because that's what I've used for the last decade. Well, I got it all together. I got the last few components needed, and I took it out for the first ride. And suddenly I realized I had something here. I had moved from a Lincoln Continental to a Porsche as far as speed. I mean, man, it just glided along the road. I'm like, this is amazing. The first time, I'm like, man, this is a lot better time than on the Lincoln Continental where I was riding for the last 10 years. I mean, this big tank I was riding on. And I thought, I had no idea what I had in my basement. It was a gift given to me that I had not yet stewarded. Now, when it comes to this idea of spiritual leaders in a church, it can be a gift that we don't realize what God has given to His church and that we're not stewarding. And I want to make a strong disclaimer. I'm not talking about just me in the next 4 weeks. I realize I'd be considered the pastor, senior pastor of Hillview Baptist Church, but God has given us leaders in our church as a gift. You say, where do you get this idea that spiritual leaders are a gift? Ephesians chapter 4, verse 8 and 11 make it clear that Jesus ascended up into heaven and He gave gifts unto men. And then He spells out that apostles, prophets, evangelists, and pastors and teachers for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. And zooming out of that passage is saying, Christ has given His local church gifts called spiritual leaders who are supposed to build up the body to move forward for the glory of God. So I've entitled this series, as you can see up there, Stewarding the Gift of Spiritual Leadership. And we don't want spiritual leadership to be sitting in the basement collecting dust with the mindset of, yeah, I don't need anything. And they're just kind of over there. I'm glad they're there, but every church just needs spiritual leaders, of course. And I want to talk to you this evening in 1 Timothy chapter 3 on how we ought to begin to steward this idea of spiritual leadership in our church and what that would look like for us. Now, I realize what some of you are thinking. You're like, okay, I'm not a spiritual leader myself. I'm not called to be a pastor or a deacon or an overseer in any way. So what's the relevance of this? Well, I think there are two ways it's very relevant to every person here in our church family this evening. First of all, we are congregational in our government. That means that any significant decision the church decides to move forward. There's a church-wide vote on anything that's of significance. Our bylaws spell that out, that the whole congregation votes, including the offices filled by spiritual leaders. That's a decision for the congregation to make, not just for the deacons or the pastors or the staff to make. That is a church-wide decision, and you play a part in that. Therefore, you need to be understanding what God expects in spiritual leaders. And then secondly, God is going to lay down in 1 Timothy chapter 3 the qualifications for spiritual leaders, particularly the pastor, which we're going to look at this evening. And we're going to look at those 5 components, five aspects that are essential for a pastor. And these are laid down not just for this bar to be raised for the pastor and all the other congregation is way down here. The reason God raises a bar for the pastor or pastors is because the congregation shouldn't just be over here saying, oh, we'll never attain to that up there. No, they're an example for the congregation to strive and grow to model those same qualities. Now, to be very specific, there are only 2 qualities specified in 1 Timothy chapter 3 that we're going to look at that cannot be modeled by everybody. And those are the desire to pastor and being apt or able to teach. Every other quality is seen elsewhere in the New Testament. And therefore, the reason I lay these out is because these are qualities that all of you should be striving for, minus those 2 that I just mentioned. Because pastors are the example of these qualities so that all of us have a picture as far as what this looks like. I mean, it's one thing to look at this and say, okay, not given to wine or not self-willed. Okay, that's abstract, but what does that look like? Well, if it's modeled by the leadership, you have a clear picture of what that should be. And so I want to go through and specify what those qualities are. Now, we're going to begin in verse 1 of chapter 3. Paul is writing to a young preacher named Timothy in an established church in Ephesus. And he's already talked about the false teachers. Watch out for them. And in verse 1, notice how he begins. This is a true saying. If a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach. Not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous. One that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must have a good report of them which are without, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. Now, we'll also be alluding to Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 7. That is kind of the sequel to this list, also written by Paul. And we won't turn there for time's sake at this point, but I'll be referencing Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 9. So what are the qualifications of this bishop that's mentioned here? Now, before I even mention the bishop, you might be saying, okay, you've talked about bishop, pastor, even this idea of elder. What are we all talking about? Are these 3 different officers? To be very clear at the outset, when it says bishop, it's referring to the same thing as the pastor. You say, where in the world do you get that? Well, I want to show 3 words up here. Gentlemen, if you can pull up the 3 words up there, you'll notice, first of all, that you have the word bishop in this passage, the word bishop. And as you look at the word bishop, you can go over to Titus chapter 1, verse 5, and it says, ordain elders in every city. And then it goes on 2 verses later, still talking about the same office, and it says, For the bishop must be blameless. So it's saying elder in every city. Now, let me talk about this elder, and I'm going to call him a bishop as well. And so we need to understand that a bishop is equal to an elder. It's the same thing. And you say, okay, what about this idea of a pastor? Where does that come from? Well, if we fast forward to 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, you read that it says, to the elders I exhort you to do something. And it says, feed the flock of God. That's the verb form of pastor. Pastor the flock of God. And so you have three biblical terms. You have bishop, elder, and pastor. They're all the same office. They're just focusing on different functions, which we'll get into in a couple of weeks. And so if we can put it this way, can you have those words come up there, gentlemen? Are all three of them up there? Oh, okay, great. I'm the blind man. Thank you very much. All right, bishop, elder, and pastor. And so they're all equal across the board. And now your pastor can actually see what's going on here. So when we come to this idea of bishop, we're referring to the pastor. We all together on this? And so what are the marks of this bishop, elder, pastor? I believe it breaks down to 5 different categories of character that we need to understand. First of all, there is desire. A pastor must have desire. Now, there's 2 Greek words for desire in this verse because it appears twice in our English Bible. It says, if a man desired the office of a bishop, he desireth the good work. That first word, desire, is the Greek word orgatai, which has the idea of reaching forth for something. It's setting your eyes on that, and I'm going to reach forth. I'm going to strive for that. Now, by implication, it's really referring to there is a striving for, like, I'm functioning. I want to grow into something like that. And so it's implying some functionality already. And by the way, if I can stop, we always want men to be functioning in a certain role before they have the title for that role, ideally. We all together on that? In other words, you don't take a novice and say, hey, we're going to call you a pastor now. Live up to it. No, we want somebody who is growing and they're functioning in that realm first before we actually move them to an official office that would have a title with it. And so even verse 1 is describing that. If any man desire the office of a bishop, orgatai, they're reaching for, they're starting to show this functionality at that level. They don't have the title yet, they don't have the position, but they're reaching for that. Okay. He desireth a good work. Here's the second word, desire. This is not the same word, orgatai. It is the word epithume, which means a hyper desire. Epi is an emphasis. Thume is desire. And so it's basically saying he is passionate about a very good work. He set his heart in a good direction. So there must be passion that exudes out of this person, this man who is wanting and functioning like a pastor. But the last phrase I want you to see is not that he just desires, but he desires a good work. Now, this word good is a very general Greek word. It means something positive. It means noteworthy. It means valuable. And the word work means you're going to exert yourself. And when it comes to the idea of pastoring, it is a good work. You say, why is it a good work? Well, it is good because you get to pour your heart in the lives of people and see them transformed by the grace of God. You get to build up the people of God. You get to influence them. You get to have the Lord just work through you to impact people that you never even imagined. It's a good work, but it is still work. Because there are sometimes, for a pastor doing his job, sleepless nights because they're going in their mind as far as how am I going to confront this person? There's going to be times where there's a long day, 12 hours or more, because there's people that need to be visited. There are details that need to be tended to. There's going to be some sleepless nights. Somebody's losing a loved one, and you're with them into a late night hour. There's work that's involved, but it's a good work. Let me put it this way. Based on this phrase, good work, laziness has no room in ministry whatsoever. A lazy man should never be a pastor. God calls the diligent to pastor, and those who have a work ethic, and those who are up to embracing this good, noble work that we see described here. So there is a desire. Let me put it yet another way. It's almost as if before he even builds the structure of character for a pastor, he says, hey, let me talk to you about the fuel that just feeds this engine of ministry. And there must be some fuel that just propels this man forward to do the work that God has called him to do. So desire, he stretches himself for a good work. But then secondly, in verse 2, the very beginning of this verse, there's character described. There's character. He must have a blameless reputation. In verse 2, it says, a bishop then must be blameless. That word blameless implies not sticking. It's a negative word saying that, okay, certain things stick, certain things are associated with this, but there is no association with any accusation that might come their way. So in other words, people might hurl an accusation like, oh, I know what that guy is. I've seen him messing around. He's not faithful to his wife. But you look at his life and it's like, look at their amazing marriage. I mean, look at his testimony. That's a ridiculous claim. That's not going to stick because this guy's blameless. Look at the track record here. And so it's not saying he's immune to accusation. It's just saying the accusations just don't stick over time because there's nothing sketchy going on in his life. It goes on and mentions the latter part of this verse as you move on, the husband of one wife. A very interesting phrase. In our English translation, it's used the word husband, but that Greek word is often translated husband. It can also just mean a man. A man with one wife or woman. So another way, if you were to literally translate this, it's saying a one-woman man. In other words, he is known for giving himself to one woman. He's dedicated to that woman. He's not messing around. He doesn't flirt. Oh, he's kind, he's gracious, but he doesn't flirt. He's not seeking the attention to see if I can win other women over as far as their affections. A one-woman man. That means that he's been faithful to his spouse over the years. He's never been the one to play it loose, causing his marriage to crumble apart. He's showed a character and his commitment by sticking with that woman that he's committed his life to. He goes on and uses another word here in verse 2, vigilant. It has the idea that he watches carefully. He has a periphery about him, and he can just scope things in. I'm thankful when it comes to this word vigilant that when I was an intern at Eastland Baptist Church under my mentor, Dave Hardy, he just constantly had to coach me. Davidson, you need a periphery. You need to be able to see a little bit more than like what's right in front of you there. And just that idea of being vigilant is so crucial to be aware and to strive to know what's going on around him spiritually. And then also the word sober. That means you have discretion that masters your desires. You're thinking things through with God's wisdom rather than giving yourself over to impulses, whether financially or sensually or just in your anger responding to things. You're thinking through God-given wisdom. That means that is sobriety or being sober. And then you also have another word here of a good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach. It's interesting that this is really describing in general just a disciplined life of good behavior. He has things under control. His desires aren't running rampant. Titus 1 verse 8 adds 2 words to the character that aren't mentioned here. And I encourage you to jot these down. He mentions this man being just, he does what's right, and holy, he's set apart. So zooming out a little bit, you have desire, that's the fuel, and then the character is like the conduit through which the fuel goes. And you can't just have fuel just spilling all over the place. It has to be directed. And so you have the passion, but then you have the conduit, the character directing that passion in the right way. But then as you move on to the third category of qualifications, there's love. This man has a loving heart. Look at what it says, that last phrase in verse 2, given to hospitality. That literally means he's a lover of strangers. In other words, he's okay connecting with new people. He might be introverted. He might not be like just wearing his emotions on his sleeve and just outgoing and the life of the party, but he's okay connecting with new people in his life and having people in. And being okay with God sovereignly bringing unsaved people into his life that he can connect with and even lead to the Lord. Given to hospitality, and then that idea of apt to teach. He is able to take the Scriptures and lovingly impart them to the people of God because he loves those people. He wants them to grow and move forward in their Christian experience. It's interesting, Titus, if you were to write these couple references, rather than saying a lover of strangers, it says a lover of good men in Titus chapter 1, verse 8. So it kind of opens it up more and says not just strangers, but all good men. He loves being around good people. And then also, rather than just describing apt to teach in Titus chapter 1, verse 9, it says holding fast the faithful word. It implies that he grasps doctrine and can handle that and explain that to others in a way that is understandable. Let me put it yet another way. The pastor doing his job is not the equivalent as the guy just going and pumping gas at the 76 station down the road. Just doing it because, okay, this is something that's going to pay the bills. He has a love in his heart. He loves what he does and it delights in that. And you see that described here in verse 2. So you have desire, you have character, you have love, and then you jump down to verse 3, and there's a fourth category, and that is self-control. Self-control, look at what it says. Not given to wine. Now, an interesting Greek phrase here. When it says not given to wine, you think, okay, it's talking about the addict, somebody who was just walking around and they struggle with drunkenness. But someone who is given to wine is literally someone who is hovering over wine. It actually comes from a root meaning to hover. He's hovering over the wine, man. He's always like really close to it. Always wanting to reach for it. He has this desire for it. Well, by implication, it's describing somebody who is addicted. Drunkenness. Now you say, okay, so as long as they drink occasionally and they're not drunken, it's okay for a pastor? Hey, you know, probably the best way to view this is if the danger is right here for the spiritual leader, it's better for him to just be all the way over here. You know, the old word for that is teetotaler. Does that ring a bell? Back in the day, one of those vintage words. But it means I'm just free from alcohol. I'm going to just stay away from it. That's the safest approach. That's ideal for a pastor. And that's a stance I've taken over the years. Just stay away from the stuff. I don't even have to worry about being given to wine. Also, it's biblical when you say in Proverbs chapter 25, it says, don't even look upon the wine when it swirls itself in the cup. Don't even put yourself in the area of temptation as a spiritual leader. But there is love and then there is self-control. He's not given to wine. It goes on and says he's not a striker. He doesn't react by punching somebody. He's not greedy, a filthy lucre. It's not that he is just out there to try to seek to gain profit from his ventures. But he's patient. He has a long wick. He's not a brawler. He's not always looking for a fight. Boy, some Baptists would struggle with that term, huh? Not a brawler. He's not up there just looking for something to duke it out over. Then he goes back and circles around to this a synonym for a greedy when he says, and not covetous. Now, self-control, he has harnessed his desires, but twice it refers to his desires with money and possessions. Interesting, isn't it? So it's not saying he doesn't have any possessions. It means he's not greedy with his possessions and his stuff. So that's the negative. What would be the positive quality to show that somebody's not greedy or covetous? What is it? Say it again. He's generous. He's gracious. He gives. He holds his possessions with palms up. It says, I'm I want to bless others with the resources I have. That all goes back to self-control. So this man has harnessed his desires. Titus 1, 7 and 8 adds two other qualities here. It says that he's not self-willed, referring to his pride. He's not soon angry. In other words, he doesn't lose his temper. And it says he's temperate in all things. In other words, he's under control. He has self-control in his life. So we see 4 qualities so far. You see them up there? Let's say them together. You ready? You got them right up there. Desire, character, love, and self-control. What's the 5th one? The 5th one is he has experience. He has experience in his Christian life. In other words, he has a track record of faithfulness. Look at what it says in verse 6. Not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. So you see somebody who's doing the Christian life, it's easy for them to get offended. And they stumble and stutter as they try to find themselves in the Christian life. Man, they've been at it a year. Well, that's great. But they still get tripped over certain things. They kind of get flustered. They get offended and frustrated about certain things. Well, 2 years into it, well, it's getting a little better. But the idea of this, if you're going to take somebody at that point at 2 years, they're getting better, and you put them in the realm of leadership, they're not going to be able to handle the offense that comes with that. Let me put it bluntly. People are irritating to work with sometimes. I mean, I love them, but people can be very irritating. If they're not ready for that and they're put up in that position, they're going to fall by the wayside and be offended by the pressure that goes along with that. And not having maybe the patience, as well as the ego can get to them. Look at me. I've arrived. And I have this position. I have this title. No, man, if you haven't lived and functioned that way for a few years, you're probably not ready for the title. So not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. And then another aspect of his experience is found in verse 7. Moreover, he must have a good report of them which are without. Even outsiders would look at this man and say, okay, he does have a good testimony. He does not owe us money from those tracts he bought a while back or ordered. He's not the guy that has his car worked off with the mechanic and has an extra set of keys and just drives his car off without paying for it. He has a good testimony to everybody that would know him, in general, in the public, and say, you know what, this guy, he follows through when he says he's going to follow through. He has a good testimony. He loves his wife. Look at him. It goes on and says in the last phrase there, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. Titus does add a couple of aspects here. It does mention, Titus chapter 1, verse 6, that he has faithful children, not accused of riot or unruly. So children that are in the home, they are at least respectful, and they're in general following their dad's orders or his desires and going along with that rather than being a black sheep that's out there getting into trouble. But Timothy elaborates more than that back in verse 4. And I know I jumped ahead, now I'm jumping back. Verse 4, one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Let me put it simply. He's pastoring his own house first. If he can't pastor his own house, he has no business pastoring the flock of God. Simply stated. And I realize that all these qualities tend to raise the bar very high as far as how in the world can you attain to this. It's not describing perfection, though. This isn't an impeccable man, because that does not exist. This guy's unqualified if that's the case. But it's just describing someone who has a track record of these qualities seen over time. So bringing all these 5 qualities together, what I want to leave you with this evening is we ought to steward God's gift of spiritual leadership in your life. That bike frame sat in my basement for a little while and got it up, and I enjoyed driving the Porsche or the Lincoln Continental. But after a while, I'm like, man, I didn't realize I had this. And so I decided I was going to steward this. You know what had all these scratches on it from the moving around the basement? concrete walls, concrete floor. I thought, you know what? I'm invested in this. I want to take this and get this thing powder coated. I want to get the fork. I want to get a paint job that's professionally done. I want to get decals for this. And I moved forward because I realized what I had, and I wanted to take care of this, especially in the Oregon rain. In the same way, if God has given you spiritual leaders, we ought to steward them. And I know what you're asking because I was asking the same thing. Okay, so how do we do that? What difference does that make? How do we steward the spiritual leaders in our church? Well, here's the first way. Your selection. Your selection. You say selection, what do you mean by that? When I say selection, you have the authority to vote in your spiritual leaders over time. I went through that in 2003, November 16, 2003. There are a handful of people that met at 18th and Centennial, a little storefront building, and 15 adults, with my not being there, hand in their ballots, and they voted 14-1 to call this 25-year-old rookie that was up in Seattle. They were that desperate. And even that, I didn't get a unanimous vote, but the congregation decided. This is our choice. We're that desperate to call this guy down who's never pastored in his life that the congregation decided that. That wasn't my decision. It wasn't the trustees' decision at that time. It's a congregational vote. See, what's the big deal about that? Are you thinking about resigning? No, but I'm putting you at ease. I'm not thinking about resigning for you to find another pastor. But God has his ways of, over time, raising up other associate pastors and assistant pastors. And when that time comes, you have a say in that. And you vote as far as these spiritual leaders that are going to be over you. You say, well, of course. But here's what I want to, please don't miss this. You don't vote on your personal whims, whether you like the guy or not. You can't say, I like his personality or I don't like his personality. That's not in 1 Timothy chapter 3. His personality. He grates on me with certain things he says or does. That's not in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Does he have character? Does he have desire? Does he have these other qualities that we looked at here? Vote based on the biblical qualities, not your whims. It's not a personality contest. This isn't politics. We want to follow the biblical guidelines as we vote different officers into the position over Hillview Baptist Church. So selection is one area. And then also our growth. Our growth. In other words, I lay out these qualities to you this evening so you have something to aim for. I mean, outside of desire and being apt to teach, all of you ought to be striving for these qualities in your life. I mean, none of you should be drunk. None of you should be soon angry. None of you should be self-willed. Are we all together on this? This isn't just the pastor's job description. This is all of our job description here, or qualifications. And so we ought to be striving for these areas of growth in our life. And may God use the role models of spiritual leaders to give us something concrete to grab a hold of and say, yeah, that's what I want to be like as far as those qualities. So there's selection, there's our growth, but then last but definitely not least, there is consideration. Consideration. God will continually work in our men to raise up pastors. And the best pastors are the pastors that come from their congregation. They're not imported from another place. It takes a long time for imports to get the philosophy, to understand the rhythm of the church, for the church family to accept that import, if you will. But if somebody is homegrown, they're part of the body. They know how people think. And God could eventually call some of you, stir up your desire to pastor, to shepherd. And you're already part of the flock. You're already part of this body. And you get to play a part in shepherding the people of God. And so when I use that word consideration, you ought to consider that stirring, that call of God in your life to play a part in overseeing the flock of God. Now, bringing all this together, let's be invested in our leadership. That's not a spectator sport. Oh yeah, that's leadership. They do their thing. We just kind of sit back here and do our thing. No, there's a relationship between the congregation and the leadership. For one, we're all part of the same body. I'm a member of this body as well. Our deacons are a member of the same body. We're not over the body, like being above and beyond. No, we're all together the same, but you need to realize that you have influence with the leadership of this church. One other thought. As we select different leaders and vote on them, we do from time to time have different votes to accept new deacons or to approve new pastors. And you have a say even in recommending people. Now, I realize if there's only one person that recommends this individual over here and nobody else agrees with them, okay, that person probably isn't going to be selected, okay? So just because you recommend somebody doesn't mean that they're going to be, oh yeah, they're going to be on the church ballot. But you have a say. As you see men in our church that are pastoring, they're shepherding, like, man, it's like that guy's a pastor. And he's functioning at that level. Give me some feedback. Give our deacons some feedback. Talk to them. Make a recommendation because you have a say in this. And if enough people are saying the same thing, it's like, okay, yeah, we ought to consider this guy because he's functioning like a pastor. He's overseeing the flock of God. He's caring for people's souls. Maybe we ought to move forward with making this official. And so I just want you to know you have a part that you play in this process. So let's go and stand together as we conclude our time this evening. Not going to have an invitation, more of a teaching time rather than a preaching time this evening. And let's ask God to just guide us in this area of spiritual leadership. And Lord willing, next week we'll talk about deacons and who they are and what they do in the local church context. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you very much for the spiritual leaders you've given our church. I'm thankful for my fellow leaders that lead alongside of me, and they oversee various aspects of the ministries here. So thankful for the part they play and the many hours they put in. But I pray that you would guide us as we look out among our congregation and consider various men, but also help us to grow to live out these same qualities that we described here. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. God bless you for being here this evening.